Hello everyone, this is Mr. Vanderpool. Now for this next video we're going to be talking about some fiscal policy side effects. Crowding out of investment and net exports and crowding in of investment and net exports. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So we're going to start off with crowding out. So this is going to be the side effect of an expansionary fiscal policy. We are increasing government spending and lowering taxes. And the side effect is what's called crowding out of investment and net exports. So a possible side effect of increased government spending and reduced taxes is a budget deficit, which may lead to the crowding out of gross private investment as well as net exports. And we're going to hit each one of these. So let's go ahead and start off with the crowding out of gross private investment. We've actually already talked about this. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put a loanable funds graph right next to our investment demand graph. Okay, so with our loanable funds graph, we have real interest rate on our y-axis, quantity of loanable funds on our x-axis. We have an upward sloping supply of loanable funds. We have a downward sloping demand for loanable funds. And then on our investment demand graph, we have real interest rate on our y-axis, gross private investment on our x-axis. And we have our downward sloping investment demand curve. So we start off at equilibrium here, where DLF meets SLF. And you're going to have an equilibrium real interest rate represented by the variable R, an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds represented by the variable Q. And then you're going to go ahead and extend over from your loanable funds over to your investment demand graph. Remember, loanable funds and investment demand graphs have to be right next to each other. And you can see we have a level of investment there called I. So now here's what's going to happen. The government here, let's say the US government, is going to do an expansionary fiscal policy, meaning that they're going to increase government spending and they're going to decrease taxes. That is going to create budget deficits where the government is going to be borrowing to spend. So when the government borrows to spend, they are going to demand loanable funds. So therefore, the demand for loanable funds is going to shift to the right from DLF to DLF 1. So now we have our new equilibrium, our loanable funds. And you're going to see the real interest rate went up to R1. And the quantity of loanable funds went up to Q1. Now we're going to go ahead and extend that equilibrium real interest rate at R1 over to the investment demand graph. We go down, and we can see we have a drop in investment from I to I1. So you can see that gross private investment fell. So here's basically what happened. You had an increase in government spending and or decrease in taxes. The government deficit spent. That implied that the demand for loanable funds shifted to the right, which implied that your real interest rate went up, which implied that gross private investment went down. So basically what happened is this government spending crowded out gross private investment. So government spending went up, which can be helpful to gross domestic product, but gross private investment went down, which hurts gross domestic product. And the overall effect on real gross domestic product is debatable. But nevertheless, it's important to understand that when the government deficit spends, it increases real interest rates and lowers the amount of gross private investment in an economy. All right, so let's take a look at the crowding out of net exports here. So we're going to go ahead and look at the top of the page where it says crowding out of xn. So what's going to be happening here is we already saw that when the government deficit spent, it increased the demand for loanable funds. That increased the real interest rate. Well, this is going to crowd out your net exports as well. So let me explain what that top area means. So we already know there's an increase in the real interest rate. Okay, that rightward arrow means implies, and the upward arrows mean up and down. So when we have an increase in the real interest rate, that implies that you have an increase in the demand for the dollar. So for example, if the real interest rate went up in the United States, people would start demanding dollar-denominated financial assets, U.S. bonds, U.S. stocks, dollar-denominated financial assets. In order to buy those assets, they have to buy dollars. They have to demand dollars. Okay, and they want to buy these assets because the real return on them is more because the real interest rate went up. So, when the real interest rate went up, that implies that you have an increase in the demand for the dollar in this case. That is going to imply a stronger dollar. The dollar becomes a stronger currency when people start demanding it. And that is going to imply that net exports are going to drop. Because as the dollar becomes stronger, American goods become more expensive in other countries. It's more difficult for people in other countries to buy American goods because their currency doesn't buy as many dollars. So therefore, you're going to see net exports fall. Okay, so that increase in the real interest rate also will lower net exports, which will hurt gross domestic product. All right. So now let's take a look at the contractionary fiscal policy side effects, which is the crowding in of investment and net exports. So this is the opposite of crowding out. So a possible side effect of decreased government spending and increased taxes, and this comes from a contractionary fiscal policy where the government spending less and taxing more, is a budget surplus where the government is saving money, which may lead to the crowding in of gross private investment as well as net exports. Now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the crowding in of investment and the crowding in of net exports. So let's start off looking at the bottom section where we're talking about the crowding in of gross private investment. And once again, here what we're going to have is we're going to have a loanable funds graph right next to an investment demand graph. Okay, with a loanable funds graph, we have a real interest rate on our y-axis, quantity of loanable funds on our x-axis. We have downward sloping demand curve, DLF, upward sloping supply curve of SLF. And that initial equilibrium, we are at R and we are at Q. Okay, and when we go ahead and go over from our loanable funds equilibrium, real interest rate of R, we go over to the investment demand and go down, you can see that you now have a level of gross private investment called I. So when the government saves, okay, due to this contractionary fiscal policy, that is going to increase the supply of loanable funds. So the supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the right, here from SLF to SLF1. You can see that on the graph, and where SLF1 beats DLF, we have our new real interest rate, R1. We have our new quantity of loanable funds, which is Q1. So from R1, we're going to go all the way across onto our investment demand curve, and we're going to go all the way down. And we can see that we now have more investment. We are now at I1. So the amount of gross private investment has increased. So here's what happened. Okay, when the government ran that budget surplus, okay, they saved money, that increased the supply of loanable funds, which implies that the real interest rate goes down. When the real interest rate goes down, you're going to see a growth in gross private investment because it is cheaper to borrow and invest. Okay, that is called the crowding in of investment. The increase in the supply of loanable funds lowered your real interest rate and increased the amount of gross private investment. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the crowding in of net exports. So we can see from that loanable funds graph that the real interest rate went down when the supply of loanable funds shifted to the right. That's going to have an effect on net exports. So let's take a look at that middle section where it says the crowding in of net exports. So we're going to start off with our lower real interest rate. So our lower real interest rate is going to imply, remember the rightward arrow here means implies, that there is going to be a decrease in demand for the dollar. So what ends up happening here is because there are lower real interest rates, let's say in America, okay, people are not going to demand dollar-denominated assets. Okay, they're not going to want to buy or they're going to sell American bonds and stocks. So therefore, they do not need dollars to buy those stocks and bonds. So therefore, the demand for the dollar is going to go down. When the demand for the dollar goes down, that implies that the dollar will become weaker. And that implies that net exports is going to go up. Because now the dollar is weaker, so people in other countries can less expensively buy our stuff. So therefore, we can export more because their currency will buy more of ours cheaper. Okay, so people in other countries can more easily and cheaply buy our stuff with a weak dollar. So you can see when you had a budget surplus, you had a couple of positive things happen. You had a crowding in of the gross private investment and net exports. And that crowding in can definitely help gross domestic product. Unlike where you had the budget deficit from the expansionary fiscal policy, which actually ended up hurting gross private investment and net exports. Okay, let's go ahead and move on here. To our assessment. So for number one, we're going to graph and explain what would happen to the equilibrium price level, real GDP, unemployment, and inflation rate in the short run if the economy is in recession. So we start off under ADAS in a recessionary gap, and there is an increase in government spending. So we start off with the gap, we go ahead and shift aggregate demand the right way back to full employment output, and then tell me what happened to the price level, real GDP, unemployment, and inflation. And then for number two, we're going to describe what fiscal policy actions the government can use to stimulate the economy and to contract the economy. So to stimulate the economy, you're going to want to have an expansionary fiscal policy. So tell me what you do with government spending and taxes there. To contract the economy, you're going to want a contractionary fiscal policy. So tell me what you would do with government spending and taxes there. All right, so I'll give you a few seconds to do that. You can pause if need be. And we'll do the summary. So in a paragraph, describe what you've learned today. I will check these tomorrow, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.